Copenhagen, United Nations Climate Conference. Tens of thousands march peacefully as industrial, developing nations argue. Several hundred people, among tens of thousands of activists, have been detained as industrial countries at the United Nations Climate Conference have criticized a draft pact for not making stronger demands on major developing countries. A police officer received minor injuries when he was hit by a rock thrown from a group of protestors, and one protester was injured by fireworks. Police say they have rounded up more than 600 people at the rally, part of a worldwide day of action. There was some cobblestone throwing, and at the same time people were putting on masks, said a police spokesman. We decided to go for preventive detentions to give the peaceful demonstration the possibility to move on. Earlier, police said they had detained 19 people, mainly for breaking Denmark's strict laws against carrying pocket knives or wearing masks during demonstrations. Most of the 4-mile-long march was held in a carnival atmosphere. Estimates of the number of people in the march under chilly, sunny skies varied from a police estimate of 25,000 to 100,000 given by organizers, who hope to pressure the delegates and summit next week of 110 world leaders, some activists dressed as polar bears, some as penguins with signs like "Save the Humans." Some held a giant balloon of an inflatable snowman about to melt, a symbol of warming tied mainly to the burning of fossil fuels that the United Nations Panel of Climate Sciences say will bring floods, desertification, heat waves, and rising seas. There is no Planet B, and change the politics, not the climate, read other banners. Mountains are changing, glaciers are melting, said one protester who came to Denmark to demonstrate with 30 mountaineers. He said, now is the time to think about future generations. Decision time. Activists said 4,000 events, such as marches or candlelit vigils, were being held from Fiji to the United States to show support for deep cuts in greenhouse gas emissions. In Australia, Walk Against Warming marches were held in several cities. In Sydney, protesters carried placards saying, "No new coal mines," a reference to Australia's status as one of the world's leading exporters of coal. In Italy, thousands staged stunts and protests in 100 plazas across the country, from Venice's St. Mark's Square to a historical plaza in downtown Rome. In Manila, Philippines, 200 activists staged a festive rally. Some progress, but also tension. At the conference hall in Copenhagen, delegates said negotiators had advanced on texts such as defining how new green technologies, such as wind and solar power, can be supplied to developing nations, and in promoting use of forests to soak up greenhouse gases. We have made considerable progress over the course of the first week, said the Danish cabinet minister who presides over talks. But delegates said there were deep splits on issues such as raising funds for poor nations and sharing out the burden of greenhouse gas emissions curbs. A tightly focused summit or document was meant to lay out the crunch themes for environment ministers to wrestle with as they prepare for a summit of some 110 heads of state and governments at the end of next week. Environment ministers start arriving in the Danish capital Saturday for informal talks before world leaders. Kyoto would be extended for now. The draft distributed to the 192-nation conference set no firm figures on financing or on cutting greenhouse gas emissions. It said all countries together should reduce emissions by a range of 50% to 95% by the year 2050, and rich countries should cut emissions by 25 to 40% by 2020, in both cases using 1990 as a baseline year. The draft continues a system for industrial countries set up in the 1997 Kyoto Protocol, by which they are legally bound to targets for emission reductions and face penalties if they fall short. It makes no similar requirements of developing countries like China and India, which have pledged to reduce the growth rate of emissions, but reject the notion of turning those voluntary pledges into legal commitments. So far, industrial nations' pledges to cut emissions have amounted to far less than the minimum. The draft also left open the form of the agreement, whether it will be a legal document or a political declaration. European Union leaders announced in Brussels this week, after 2 days of tough talks, that they would commit $3.6 billion a year until 2012 to a short-term fund for poor countries. Most of this money came from Britain, France, and Germany. Many cash-strapped former East Bloc countries balked at donating, but eventually all gave at least a token amount to preserve the 27-nation bloc's unity. Still unknown is how much the wealthier nations, such as the United States and Japan, will contribute. Also, there will be more like promises than actual commitments. Perhaps next year they will decide on reductions in greenhouse gas emissions, many people say. And again, these are more signs of the end times transition days. Transition is an ongoing, continuing process. It's happening every day and in so many different ways. And there are many, many signs of all kinds happening all around the world.